My name is Tamisha Torres Walker. I am the co-founder, executive director of Safe Return Project here in Contra Costa County, and currently I sit on the Antioch City Council representing District 1, and I live in District 1. I grew up in Richmond, California, not Richmond, Virginia. and what people would call deep sea Richmond. Mostly raised by my grandmother. I have 5 uncles, 1 auntie who was in Raleigh, North Carolina. My mom is not the only daughter, but she's the only daughter that came from Raleigh with my grandmama as a kid. So it was pretty interesting being raised in Richmond by 5 uncles, no aunties. Spent most of my childhood and young adult life as a tomboy. So it's kind of crazy. And growing up in Richmond, it was, you know, the good came with the bad. I think a lot of people just associate Richmond with violence and bad stuff. But when I was growing up, there was that, but there was also community, a lot of community. Everybody knew each other, everybody knew each other's kids. You know, you could go, if somebody wasn't home, you could go to somebody else's house and eat dinner while you waited on your grandmama to come. You know, everybody looked out for each other too. So that also existed. And, you know, getting outside was the norm. Being at the park, riding bikes, hanging out with your friends. And, you know, it was the dangers too of gun violence, a lot of gun violence. And also just growing up where there was a lot of activity that kids probably shouldn't live around. And so that was, you know, I just say a lot of good came with the bad as well. So I had a balanced childhood. I wish I wouldn't have had to live with as much violence as I did, and had so many encounters with the police. Other than that, I think growing up in Richmond is what shaped me to be who I am today, and I wouldn't change it for nothing. Poverty and violence has shaped my perception on life just through, you know, personal experience. Like I said, growing up in Richmond, you know, we didn't have a lot. You know, my grandmother raised 5 kids on her own. She had to do what she had to do to take care of them. And, you know, sometimes, you know, I've lived in situations where I went without food, you know, without power, just the essential basic things that you would say you need as a child. I went without. I'm a domestic violence survivor. So I've experienced that kind of violence, and I've grown up in a home with domestic violence as well. You know, we talked about Richmond and Richmond having violence. And so when I think about living in poverty and experiencing violence and what that kind of does to you, it's like, it's a trauma. Trauma doesn't go away, right? It leaves a scar. And so losing I've experienced violence and lost a lot of friends to gun violence, but losing my younger brother to gun violence in the city of Richmond in 2005, when he was the 45th homicide that year, where he was shot 43 times and 3 times in the head on his way home from his first job and died. And my family was devastated. I don't think some of us will ever recover from that. And, you know, that kind of trauma, you got to figure out a way to turn it around. My life went downhill from there. Like, it was not an easy climb to get to where I am today. And so when I think about poverty and its relation to violence and my early experiences, it wasn't just police violence. It was community violence. It was violence in the home, just not having, you know, what you need in the face of all that you're experiencing in life that you shouldn't have to as a young person, as a young adult. And then even that climb is even steeper because there are no resources in the community. The question is always going to come up about my sons and the incident with the Antioch Police Department in December 2020 when I first got elected to office.
These motherfuckers think that I give a shit about being a city council member when it comes to my kids. I absolutely do not.
I've definitely talked to community members who voted for me, who supported me, my run for office. And I have to admit that the number one thing that I regret from that video overall was saying that I didn't care. That I didn't care about being elected to office here in Antioch, that I didn't care about being a city council member because, you know, people elected me to care. And so that really hit home for me. Like that hit me in the heart. And I had to back up and say, like, man, people elected me to care. So I can't say I don't care about the position, because I do. What I also understand is that I'm human. And like, you know, my early traumas are gonna be triggered, especially experiences with police. And all I can do each time is figure out a way to learn and to do better the next time. Like that's the best part of, you know, living in this society and being human, is that every day you get to start over, despite your mistakes. After all of my experiences with law enforcement early, growing up, you know, experiencing raids, police kicking in your door, running in your house in like full riot gear, pointing guns at children. You know, I was 5 years old the first time I experienced a raid in the home that I grew up in, and I had guns pointed at me as a child. So those experiences kind of like shaped some of, you know, the continued things that I used to experience in the community. And then also just like Trayvon Martin and Eric Garner, and then like all of these collective experiences of watching people in dark bodies, especially Black men, in these situations with law enforcement where they don't walk away alive. And then to be a mom to 2 sons who are growing to be Black men, when I have this encounter with a police department that I don't know, where I don't have relationships, even as a newly elected official in this city, didn't make me feel like I had any like power or authority. And in that moment, all I could do was operate in fear. And the outward expression of fear for me was anger, frustration, and just not understanding how I could live in this community for 8 years, not have one negative interaction or experience with the police department until I get elected to office and my children are put in danger. And so, you know, when you ask, when people ask, could I showed up another way? Could I have been a little bit more tempered? Of course, I'm sure I could have. And I really, you know, I don't even know if I could go back and do it different. I mean, the Facebook Live video, yeah, I was hot. I was steaming. I wanted people in the community, people in my community who I know, who have had similar experiences, like, to understand how frustrated I was and how angry I was and upset that these officers get to do this type. And who else children do they do it to? It wasn't just mine. I'm well educated. I run a whole organization for vulnerable people. I navigate a lot of spaces very well when it comes to politics, as well as public policy for the health and well-being of communities. And I'm very articulate, so I've heard. I'm that, and I'm also the mama that'll fight a bear for my kids. And it just so happened that bear just happened to be these 2 Antioch police officers that day.
Here is what we know tonight. There is an investigation into some officers from the Antioch Police Departments accused of crimes of moral turpitude.
It's described as wicked, deviant behavior that would shock a community.
Moral turpitude crimes are those crimes that have bad intent. So things like fraud and theft and other kinds of malfeasance that erode the public trust.
The fight for social justice is super important to me. Like, I've spent the last 12, 13 years of my life fighting for racial equity, making sure that, you know, I'm fighting for more resources in our communities. Because looking at how I grew up, the community that I grew up in, and being able to connect poverty to disparity and the lack of like economic upward mobility, is not an accident that our communities are the highest incarcerated. It's not an accident that the Sycamore community has young people with the most early adverse childhood experiences. It's not an accident that that community suffers the most violence in this city. It's not an accident that in that one neighborhood, the unemployment rate is 75%. It's not an accident that in the Sycamore corridor, the highest unemployed population is Black women. That's not an accident. And it's even more a miscarriage of justice when you have leaders who been in this city for years and haven't publicly acknowledged those challenges. Hey, I'm willing to be held accountable for my actions. I would just like the people who came before me to be held accountable for their inaction. Me and my family wouldn't have had to experience what we experienced. And so with my history and the work that I've done, not just locally, countywide, statewide, regionally, but nationally, around making sure that social justice is at the center and the forefront of all of our work, even in public policy, I gotta do that here in Antioch, as whether it's just as a grassroots leader or an elected leader. The last 17 months has really been like navigating in action. Having to kind of get in and put out a lot of fires has been the focus. Some of the things that I haven't gotten around to that I really want to do as a leader is, I talked about a clean district. I have been in conversations around street sweeping. I've talked about parking in the city. When do people move their cars so the street sweeper could come through and make sure the streets are clean? But the biggest challenge has been finding out that the street sweeper said that they don't clean the street sweeper doesn't pick up trash. So it's very interesting. So I have been focused on figuring out what a new contract could look like for street sweeping in the district so that we can actually keep the streets and the sidewalks clean. I have been having conversations around capital improvements in the district that I don't really get to talk about. How do we get better lighting? How do we invest in businesses to kind of clean up the businesses and do facade improvements, medians with trees? A lot of people don't think that like medians do slow traffic down. So how can we do traffic regulation through beautification as well? Those are some of the things I've been talking about that I haven't really been able to get to with all of the real critical infrastructure we've been putting in place. It's a lot of quality of life stuff that I want to attempt to do. And, you know, I'm hoping that I can continue that work. What's motivating me to do all of this, right? Why am I doing this? Why do I care about the quality of life in Antioch at all, overall? Why do I care about the quality of life in District 1? I care because Antioch is my home now. Like I'm a homeowner, a first-time homeowner here. You know, like that's huge for me, for my family. That's setting the stage for the next generation to come to me. It's a part of my legacy. And there are people here who I've met, who I've grown to care for, who I've heard their stories around what they want to see different, how belonging matters to them. And I want to be there for them. I want to be in this position to continue to raise up the voice of the community that doesn't feel like they can talk to people in City Hall.